Hi everyone, this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSTM.com and thank you for joining me today. In my previous video, I talked about creating stamped background patterns for a card. I also love to make patterns using dies, and dies are actually fantastic for this. In this video, I'll show you how to make a repeat negative die cut pattern for a summer card. This technique, however, can be applied to a variety of different projects. Depending on the die you decide to use, you can turn this into an Easter or Christmas card or anything really. And the technique is pretty easy too. So we are all used to using our matching dies together with our stamps. But we can also stretch the use of matching dies by using them on their own on a project. Of course, you can use any die for this. It doesn't have to be a die that has a matching stamp set. I just happen to pick up the die or the die shape that comes with a matching stamp. I'm not going to use the matching stamp today, just using the die. So the die I'm using today is a starfish die from the Set Sail die set from Simon. This is a small enough die to be able to die cut repeatedly on a cardstock panel, and it's also large enough so that I don't have to die cut this a million times. Basically, what we will be doing in this video is we will create a unique, one-of-a-kind die cut background. There's a huge variety of background dies out there that you can use to create a background in just one pass. You only need to send the die through your die cut machine once to cut. But you can also use individual dies to create similar backgrounds for cards. And the great thing about using individual dies is that you can make whatever design you want. And you can also mix and match dies in a background like you would mix stamps to stamp a background on a card. I've started die cutting this in the center of my panel, and I'm moving out, die cutting the same image over and over again, creating a pattern. I'm rotating my image as I don't want these images to face strictly in one direction. This isn't a symmetrical image, so I'm not trying to make a symmetrical pattern here, where everything is spaced out evenly. Now, if I were to use a symmetrical image, say a symmetrical life vest, for example, I would probably first make a grid with the help of a pencil and a ruler so that the die cut images would be evenly spaced on the background. But here I'm just aligning images as I go. I do try to stay in horizontal lines, but other than that, I'm die cutting this starfish the way I see best for this pattern. The die cutting part took me about 5 minutes, and I made a repeated negative die cut background for an A2 card. If you are making a bigger card, it will take a little longer as you'll have more die cutting to do. While I had my die cutting machine out, I also die cut several word blocks out of orange, peel, and sunshine colors of cardstock from Simon. I used summer greeting dies for this, and I actually have another card on my blog where I used just these dies to create a colorful background for a card. Now, to make my die cut background panel pop, I needed to create a splash of color to place underneath it. To do that, I'm going to use my Distress inks and watercolor cardstock. This is Tim Holtz watercolor card, and also a mini round ink blending tools to blend lots of bright colors on this background. I want to create an illusion of a hot summer sand on my card, although I'm using slightly different colors than one would usually use to create a sandy background. I'm going with wild honey, burnt lipstick, picked raspberry, crushed olive, and spiced marmalade. By the way, you can use watercolors to create a watercolor background instead if you like. Basically, I want to blend a lot of color onto the background. You can see I'm barely tapping the ink blending tool off to the side to remove some of the color, as I want these colors to be as intense as possible. You can create whatever background you want by using whatever colors you like and have whatever intensity of the colors you prefer. I just love to have the most vibrant colors on my summer cards, so this is why I'm adding so much color here. I'm also not being very particular about how and where I add that color. I just try to make sure I have one color in about 3 sections on the panel. It also doesn't really matter if I'm going to have hard edges or not, as these will blend once I add water, and most of this background will actually get covered with the die cut panel. So even if I will have any hard edges, these won't be as visible on the final project. I also added one more color to the mix, Barn Door. I didn't have an ink foam for this color to use with my ink blending tool, so I used my sponge dauber instead and added more red to this background. The next step was to add water to activate Distress ink, and I used a large and a small paintbrush to do that. The bigger the brush you use, the bigger the drops you will have. The smaller the brush, the smaller the drops. So this is something to keep in mind when you're adding water to the background. Next, I used a paper napkin and soaked up the excess water from the background and added some more smaller drops and again soaked up the water from the background. I wanted this background to have some glittery shine to it, so I grabbed my current favorite product, Sparkle Embossing Powder from Hero Arts. It's an awesome product to add no shed glitter to just about anything. I love using it with my color layering images. So I just covered the entire background, the entire ink blended background with this powder. I didn't use any embossing ink as the background was still wet, and I also didn't want to have a solid layer of this powder on there. I wanted to have spots or like sections. So I didn't use embossing ink on this background to have the powder to stick to. And you can see that the powder didn't cover the entire piece. Surprisingly, sections that had water over them didn't pick up any embossing powder, but other waterless sections did have embossing powder on them, so this is where I ended up having most of the sparkle embossing powder on this background. So this is a bit of a mixed media background, I guess, and I really love the way it turned out. I did lose a lot of the powder as I was drying it, as the paper was drying and the embossing powder had nothing to hold on to, but I didn't mind. Like I said, I didn't want to have a solid coverage there. Here's a close-up of this background and you can really catch that texture and that shine. I think it looks super cool. As I did the die cutting, I had a bit of dirt on my die cutting plate transfer onto the die cut panel. So I'm now going to clean that up with the help of adhesive eraser. You can also use a regular pencil eraser, but this adhesive one works beautifully for all sorts of small tasks like this one. Next, I'm going to foam mount this panel onto my ink blended background. I love to use foam adhesive here to have more dimension on my card, but you can also use glue to adhere it directly onto the card base or the ink blended background. I just happen to love using foam adhesive as I feel it helps the die cuts to stand out a little better. And I forgot to mention that I've already adhered my ink blended background onto a card base. I'm also going to adhere the die cut word blocks, but first I'm arranging them onto the panel, just planning the placement and making sure they look the way I want them to look. And I'm going to remove the little positive letters from the die cuts so that I have clean die cut, and I'm going to adhere them onto the card. Now I'm using glossy accents here and adding just a little bit of glue to the end of the die cuts. I'll be popping the other end of the die cut with foam adhesive. Now, the reason I'm using glossy accents is because I'm all out of my multi-medium adhesive and matte finish. Otherwise, I would have used it for this card as it dries matte and isn't visible once dry, whereas glossy accents has a glossy finish when it dries. I'm using foam adhesive for the other die cuts to pop them up on a card. I also want to add several sequins, and I'm using translucent sequins from Simon Says Stamp from one of the previous card kits, and adding yellow as well as red ones onto the card. I'm using a crystal katana tool to pick them up. I'm adding glue and replacing them on the card. I love using this tool and also my tweezers when I work with small items such as sequins. I also love adhering a clear drop inside a sequin, so I'm adding several small 4mm clear drops from Pretty Pink Posh inside the larger sequins on this card. Now, I also made one more identical card, but I didn't add sparkle embossing powder to that one, and you can really see the difference in the background here. However, I did add an ink blended starfish over the word blocks on the other card. So here's a closer look at these cards featuring repeated negative die cutting. I hope I've given you some inspiration and some good tips, and you will try die cutting patterns like this yourself. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!